we move to our next speaker, Rodrigo Verano from the Complutense in Madrid. Is a great expert on discourse, on dialogue of ancient Greek, a great expert of Plato's dialogues. And at the moment, he's also directing a project, international project on conversation and analysis in ancient Greek and Latin, Rodrigo, please go ahead.
Thank you. Hannah, it's very good to see you. I'm so happy to be here, virtually. I wish I was able, and I hope that very soon we will have the opportunity to meet again. So thank you very much for being here, and to the organizers especially. Well, I'm going to share my screen. So I'm going to work on the assumption that you are all seeing my screen and my presentation, and otherwise, please let me know. The dialogues of Plato stand as a remarkable metaphor for the gradual replacement of fading oral traditions by written formats of social communication and memory, about which Professor Slater talked yesterday. And furthermore, as conversations imagined and conceived as written products, the interrelation between orality and literacy is central to the conception of the dialogue as a genre and as a text. In fact, since the dialogues intend to recreate plausible, realistic extracts of human interaction, their composition has to address a number of problems. On the one hand, they require a fully aware knowledge of the ways and practices of naturally occurring talk. On the other hand, they have to face the challenge of adapting such practices successfully to the new features and purpose that they assume as they become texts, and particularly literary texts. So in this presentation, I will address some aspects of this process of textualization, which begins with everyday conversation and ends with literary dialogue. And I hope that these ideas will contribute to the discussion on textualization, orality, and literacy, which is meant to be the backbone of this conference. The concept of textualization, as I will be using it here, refers to the conception and formation of a literary text. I will be looking at how literary conversations are imagined, designed, and ultimately shaped, as opposed to naturally occurring talk, sometimes departing from that model and other times enhancing its most salient patterns. A key concept in this process, as I understand it, is that of a stylization, as used, for instance, by Egbert Bakker in his analysis of Homeric discourse. And I quote, stylization implies two discourses: the discourse that is the object of a stylization and the stylizing one itself. And the stylizing discourse is meant to be distinctive, but in order to be recognizable as a stylizing discourse, it has to display some essential features of its model. Well, my goal is to explore this process of stylization that conversation undergoes as it becomes a text, by comparing the conversational patterns that we find in the literary dialogues of Plato with what we know about natural talk, mainly from the contributions of conversation analysis. And I will be focusing on three specific aspects that relate to three different facets of this process. And the first one would be selection. I mean, what elements from naturally occurring talk are going to be transferred to the text? And I will be focusing on greeting routines and nonverbal elements in this part. The second one would be shaping, how those elements are shaped in the text. And I will be talking mostly about the sequential organization of talk and how it is fashioned in the text. And finally, I will have a word about purpose, on how some of those elements are repurposed or reconsidered as they are integrated into the literary text. Well, I will begin with an observation that may seem somewhat trivial, but I find interesting. out of the 34 dialogues that make up the corpus of Plato, very few open up with a greeting scene. Actually, only 5 if we focus on dialogues whose authorship is not in question. And this becomes more interesting when we contrast that number with the typology of Platonic dialogues, because most of the instances fall into the category of narrated dialogues, which are very few in the corpus, and only 1 into the dramatic type, which are the vast majority of the corpus. Most of Plato's dialogues are dramatic. So the only dramatic dialogue featuring a greeting expression would be Ion, where we find at the beginning, at the opening of Socrates' turn, ton Ion ahairen, greetings Ion, immediately followed by a question. And what we find in the second turn by Ion is actually the answer to that question. So we have kind of a defective greeting, because greetings usually come in pairs. But what we find here is a greeting expression followed by a question and then the answer to that question. But apart from this case, Plato seems to avoid including greeting scenes in the dramatic dialogues. And my question is why this is so? And I wonder this because we know that Plato is highly devoted to a naturalistic representation of talk, and greetings would make a good fit for that. Also because they come at the beginning of the conversation, and we know that Plato is particularly accurate and detail-oriented and attentive to characterization at the opening of the dialogue. So why are greeting scenes absent from the mimetic dialogue? Well, I think that precisely because he was so fond of rendering the conversation realistically, when facing the problem of textualizing greetings, he realized that there were certain elements of greetings as conversational practices that were very difficult to transfer to a literary dialogue by using the dramatic form, but could be successfully accounted for with the help of a narrative apparatus. And I mean, something that was so inextricably tied to the act of greeting as Plato saw it and knew it, that he thought that it would be necessary to bring that into the text, and otherwise it is preferable to skip the greeting scene altogether. In my view, this is why we find fewer greetings in mimetic dialogues than we do in narrated dialogues, because here, in the narrated ones, it is possible to introduce and include the nonverbal components that are as important as the linguistic expressions involved. In fact, the greeting routine is textualized in Plato following a pattern of a 6-step process, 5 of which refer to nonverbal actions, starting with the encounter. You usually find a verb pointing at the encounter. It is usually the verb catalambano, catelabom, catelabomen, etc. Then we may find an indication of eye contact with the verb horao, he saw me, or as soon as he saw me, like in those texts here. We can even find the verb aneknorisen here, indicating mutual recognition. Then the proxemics, people usually move from where they are standing and they approach the people they want to greet. And then we go to the physical gesture. Yeah, and usually we find here the verb aspaxomai, but we can find an explicit indication of handshaking, like here, labomenos tes heiros. And finally, they say hello, of course. Well, these are the elements that make the greeting a recognizable type scene, we might say, in Plato. They involve a stylization based on greetings as everyday routines. Of course, not all of those elements have to be present necessarily for the readers to recognize that they are reading a greeting scene. Well, as I have tried to show, the nonverbal elements are important in greetings, but not exclusive to them. There are so much more in the dialogues. For a catalog of nonverbal behavior, we have people staring at other people, people laughing, people causing an uproar, or remaining silent in the same sentence. We have people even getting physical, grabbing other people's clothes or shaking them, people giving a nudge with the elbow to draw someone's attention, whispering in some people's ear. And I don't have time to go through all the instances of nonverbal moves accounted for in the dialogues, but my point is that gestures and non-verbal behavior are fully accounted for in Plato's textualization of everyday talk. Now let's move to the structure of the interaction. According to conversation analysis, our everyday conversations are sequences of actions performed in a highly orderly manner according to specific patterns. And one of the most important features of such patterns is that they are sequentially organized in two member units made of two different turns that are unavoidably connected to one another. Turns at talk cannot be approached as single and independent entities. Instead, they are expected to be produced and actually produced in pairs, so that a first turn by a first speaker finds an immediate reaction in a second turn by a second speaker, such as questions are followed by answers, requests are accepted or denied, greeting formulae are reciprocated, and so on. And these two turns compound the so-called adjacency pair, which is a minimal unit of sequence organization and can be considered respectively the first and the second pair parts, as in the figure. Pairs chain together and make sequences as long as needed, and they can also be expanded by adding subsidiary pairs before, after, or in between the turns of the base pair. And those expansions are also pairs. So we find the pre-expansion here, and the insert expansion in the middle, and the post-expansion. And an SCT, this is an exceptional type of post-expansion made of one single turn at the end of the sequence, usually a greeting, or sorry, an agreement or a confirmation token. So if we see with an example, this is a totally made up conversation just for the purpose of illustration, but we find first pair with a greeting sequence, hi, hello, and then the first speaker asks a question, can I ask you something? But we can easily tell that that question is advancing the real question that comes later. This is why we call this a pre-expansion, because it is actually anticipating the main action to be performed in the next turn. Could I borrow your sweater tonight? Now, before replying to that, the second speaker opens up an insert expansion to make sure she's not mistaken about the sweater she's being asked about. After that, she closes the pair with a negative, this preferred reaction. This is why we find here the apology marker, sorry, acknowledging that the answer is not the one one might expect. And finally, the first speaker closes the exchange with a single sequence closing third turn. Now let's see how this model is adapted in Plato, and I will be analyzing the beginning of Lysis, and where Socrates is walking from the academy to the Lyceus, and he bumps into two young men, Hippothales and Ctesippus, who are hanging out at the gate of a gymnasium. And they start a conversation, but even before the characters begin to talk, we find some meta-language for the greeting, as we saw earlier, the verb synetichon, pointing at the encounter, and the expressions kaime prosionta and idon, indicators of proxemics and visual contact. As we saw earlier, this is a highly stylized way to convey that they are greeting each other. And then Hippothales introduces an apparently casual question. It's whither away and whence, where are you going? And Socrates answers, from the academy to the Lyceus, but as we keep reading, we soon realize that Hippothales has a plan. He wants Socrates to join him at the gymnasium, and that plan is what shapes his entire interaction. This is what in conversational analysis we call a conversational project. So in light of this project, now we realize that the first question wasn't that casual after all. It was a pre-sequence, a preliminary request for information before extending the invitation that comes next. And this is a very well-known pattern in naturally occurring talk. This is an example from a phone call. Nelson is trying to invite Clara for a drink. And before doing that, he extends a pre-invitation, what you're doing. And after he's got the information, he can proceed to the invitation. So an invitation has been extended, and according to the rules of preference in conversation, Socrates is expected to respond, and to respond preferably in a positive way, otherwise he will have to justify a negative answer. But Socrates is not willing to give an answer away so easily, not before he has more information about the party he's being invited to. So he delays his answer by opening insert expansions, asking Hypothales to be more specific. And Hypothales replies first with a non-verbal gesture, pointing his finger to a gate in the wall and telling him about the gymnasium and how much fun they have there and how many handsome boys they are going to meet. And he finishes his second answer with a comment, this comment, hon gedeos and soi metadidoimen, which is literally, it is a statement, but it implies a second invitation in a more indirect way, because by saying we will love you to join, there is an invitation to be easily inferred from there. But Socrates, however, he doesn't follow this lead and decides to take it as a mere comment. So he reacts with an appreciation token, this kalos poiuntes, how nice of you. And he goes on with his own strategy, adding more insert questions. Now is, who is the teacher in the gymnasium? Is your friend Nikus? Okay, he's such a good professor. And then we got the third attempt of invitation, and once again, delayed by insert expansions. Only this time, Socrates reveals what he really wants to know, and that is, who is the handsome boy with whom Hypothales is in love? And now we have a very funny turn of events, because now it's the other interlocutor, Hypothales, who replies with an evasive answer, and he really doesn't want to reveal the identity of his crush. So he cannot get away, so he goes silent, he keeps quiet, and he blushes, offering a sort of unintended nonverbal response to Socrates' question. Well, the silence gap is taken by the other guy in the scene, Ctesippus, as an opportunity to choose himself to be the next speaker and weigh in on the conversation. And this goes on and on for over 40 turns until we get to Socrates' final acceptance after a long negotiation, which looks like a casual conversation and which, as any other casual conversation, hides a project. Well, in terms of the architecture of token interaction, the succession of turns, the sequence organization patterns, including the structure of adjacency pairs and their expansions, the management of preference rules and turn allocation techniques, everything is quite in line with what we would expect in naturally occurring talk. But this is not necessarily the case in a literary dialogue. And I'm going to share with you a counterexample that is very familiar to all of us. I mean, how Homer's characters interact as they talk to each other. For instance, here is a very well-known conversation between Priam and Helen from the Iliad. Priam invites Helen to sit by him, and then he makes a comment about her and her misfortunes, and finally asks her to identify a man on the battlefield, and Helen responds with a second speech that comes next. And but if we analyze both speeches in terms of actions and compare them, we see how a sort of pattern emerges across the turns. There is a correspondence of actions between the different parts. First, a greeting or a greeting-like expression, then a statement responded to with a comment, and finally a question followed by the respective answer. The three parts cohere and make sense from a sequence organization point of view, but instead of being paired up as independent turns, we find there to be two long speeches. And this is how turns and sequences are conceived and shaped in Homeric poetry, which is very different from what we find in naturally occurring talk. And compared to Plato, they are two different models of stylization of a conversation. In terms of the sequential organization of turns, Plato's text, is closer to everyday conversation. But that doesn't mean that Plato's dialogues are not artificial. They can be quite artificial, elaborate, and in many respects as distant from everyday talk as Homer is. Only not in this regard. In this regard, in particular, the way Plato textualizes the conversation is closer to the structural patterns of interaction. And I think the application of conversation analysis to the texts provides evidence of why this is so. Just a final thought about the purpose. We are examining conversational practices in the texts in connection with the characters, plans, and projects. We should not forget about Plato's project and its impact on the interactional behavior of the characters, because textualization implies the subordination of the entire conversation to a major plan. And in this sense, the actions performed by the characters in the fictive conversation have to make sense from the perspective of the projects that those characters display, but they have to be accountable as well in terms of the author's main purpose. We have to ask ourselves, for instance, what is the point in creating a misunderstanding in a literary dialogue, because Plato's dialogues are full of them, or why some characters are presented as polite or impolite speakers, or why they laugh or get angry or blush at certain moments, not only in the light of the internal logic of the conversation, but also in relation to the ultimate purpose of Plato as a literary author. Maybe what I mean here is that there can be a sort of critical conversation analysis that can be exploited for a better understanding of Plato in terms of literary criticism. I just go to the final remarks. The process of textualizing a conversation in order to make it a literary dialogue implies the stylization of everyday talk in a number of ways, and I have tried to approach some of them here. First, it is important to identify which elements of the source are finally integrated into the text. We have seen how nonverbal elements are accounted for in Plato's texts, and how the greeting routine is stylized and turned into a type scene that is mainly based on nonverbal information. And this is why greeting scenes are frequent in narrative dialogues, but virtually absent in dramatic dialogues. Central to the analysis of the textualization process is to find out how the sequential structure of talk is accommodated to the literary format. We have found that Plato's dialogues, at least in some parts, carefully follow the structural patterns of sequence organization and preference. And the behavior of characters agrees with the patterns identified in natural talk, and the verisimilitude of the staging allows the emerging of conversational implicatures and their exploitation or not in accordance with the interests of the characters. Finally, the textualization implies the reconsideration of the conversation as a whole and its subordination to the author's intention, to which all the elements of the dialogue ultimately respond. And I hope that the analysis carried out here will be useful in better unmasking those intentions through the traces they leave in the process of turning a conversation into a literary dialogue that I have tried to address here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rodrigo.
Hi, Rodrigo. It's nice to, well, I can see you, but you can't see me.
It's Deborah, isn't it?
Yeah.
I recognize your voice.
Yeah, well, it's great to see you and to hear more of your work. You started off at the beginning talking about differences among dialogues, specifically in relation to greeting patterns. I wonder if there are other broader patterns you've noticed about different dialogues, use of textualized conversation at all, or if that's just sort of too big of a question to answer and the answer is not really.
Well, what do you mean in Plato's dialogues or in general?
In Plato's dialogues, yeah.
Yeah, no, actually, well, I like the question. I think this is the first time I have thought of, I mean, in these terms, because this was a real question I had about the greetings when I started to study conversational practices. And you know, the greetings, they are a very typical thing. They have been approached in comedy and in drama. So I wanted to do the same in Plato. And this was my surprise that I didn't find so many as I expected. So, and then I put that in relation to the dialogue type. And I feel that, I think that was your question. I feel that there is more to search here about how the conversations are textualized in the different dialogue types. But this has been actually my first step about it, and I would like to keep doing that. Was that what you ask?
She gives a thumbs up. Yeah.
Thank you.
Any more questions, remarks? Yeah, please.
Thank you. I enjoyed that tremendously. My question, and I'm not sure I can completely articulate it, is that you had me thinking about why it is that the stylization in Plato is so effective, that we really believe in these as conversations, even though almost all the real noise of conversation has been removed. Mm-hmm. People don't mumble incomprehensibly, they don't lose track and so on. And one thing I wondered is whether the way speakers in Plato have these agendas that are only gradually revealed, and I love the way you talked about that, are a device that makes us believe in these dialogues as conversations. That it's in part a verisimilitude effect. Yeah. Because that's something, of course, that people really do, as you said.
Yeah, absolutely. This is Professor Scodell, I think. Yes. I think I recognize your voice. Well, thank you very much. And absolutely, I absolutely agree. I think this is one of the best points of Plato as a literary author. He really gets the important thing about conversation is the agenda that you have. And he really gets that. People really have, what articulates a conversation as such is actually the project. It's usually a cooperative project, but independent speakers, they have independent projects and they have to intertwine that and to negotiate with their respective projects. And I think that is one of the points of the verisimilitude of Plato. And that is also why it works so good in translation, because it's not that related to the language. And when we approach the verisimilitude of Plato, people talk about particles and people talk about oral syntax and the beautiful speech, and that is true. But there is something else in the dialogues that works across languages in translation, and that might be one of those things. So thank you very much for your remark. I absolutely agree, and thank you.
Any more questions? Yeah, go ahead.
But we don't have time.
We have time. We have to.
Thank you very much, Rodrigo. And I'm going to plagiarize for myself something perhaps we had our own conversation. Plagiarize from what we have in our own conversation. I found it interesting now that there's sort of a diametrically opposed. Those dialogues which were narrated have the greeting routines, and exceptionally the direct, the more dramatic, the direct speech dialogues minimalize the greeting routine. I just want to remind here in this forum that in the ancient Greek novel, which is when it's narrated, you have beautiful sequences, which have some of the things that Ruth and Deborah mentioned, and of course the things that you mentioned today. And Yona, our student who heard your talk but had to leave now, who's working on Yona Gonopolsky, on nonverbal elements in these kind of things. It would be lovely to continue to discuss. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I love that. And it's also like a very last remark. The point is like if you read the dramatic dialogues of Plato, most of them you can actually tell that the conversation is beginning right there. I mean, some of them not, because we know that they are the continuation of a previous conversation or wherever. But some of them we can actually tell that the conversation is starting. So he decided not to include the greeting exchange, and this was my hypothesis of why is that. So thank you.